Hello everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Access Blockbusters Pod. It is episode number 43. Thank you guys so much, as always, for joining me in today's episode. And if you guys didn't notice, the release schedule for the Access Blockbusters Pod has changed up a little bit, because usually I try to release the full episode on Saturday, and then subsequently in the next coming days, I break out the episode into clips, and then we have the clips coming out as the week progresses, just in case people wanted to see just an entire video on Rings of Power or Agatha all along, etc., etc. And it makes it easier for newer people to come and discover the channel, which has been awesome to hear from a lot of different people over the last few weeks. So that's what we've been trying to do. But this week's a little bit different because I will be going to see Joker FOLIE A DEUX actually after I have been, after I usually finish up editing the majority of the podcast. And so in an effort to get my review of Joker FOLIE A DEUX in this episode, in episode 43, so that you guys can hear my thoughts right after I see it pretty much, here's the schedule. And this is a little bit of a programming note before we get into the actual episode, but I thought it would be important to let you guys know so that you guys are informed about what's going on. So what's going to happen is that I'm going to release on Saturday, 8 a.m. Pacific, 10 a.m. Central, 11 a.m. Eastern, for those of you who are in the US. I will be releasing the clip actually before I release the entire podcast. I will be releasing the clip of my episode 2 spoiler discussion of The Penguin. And I know that, just by nature of how I release and record the podcasts, that usually the Penguin episode spoiler discussions will be coming out probably just before the next episode is out. I apologize. It just is what it is because of my recording schedule. And so hopefully, it'll be coming a day early at least, because I'm planning on releasing my Penguin episode spoiler discussions, the segments at least, on Sunday morning, so that by the time you guys can watch it, then we'll head into the next episode, and then we'll have a lot to talk about the next week, and then we'll kind of roll into the next episode. So just a little bit of a change here in the future. I will be, instead of releasing the clip on Sunday and the podcast on Saturday, I will be releasing the first clip from Access Blockbusters Pod episode 43 on Saturday. So actually, by the time you're listening to this, you'll have already seen the clip from The Penguin. So just actually more of a note in hindsight, as I'm recording these ahead of time. So there is that. And then I'll be releasing the main podcast actually. So you actually won't be hearing this until Monday, because I will be releasing then the clip of the segment of me talking about Joker FOLIE A DEUX on Sunday. And so you'll see Penguin on Saturday, episode 2 on Saturday, Joker review on Sunday, and then full podcast, what you're listening to right now, on Monday. And so hopefully then you'll be able to, if you missed out on those 2 episode clips, you'll be able to catch up on it in the full podcast, as well as all the other topics that we're going to be talking about there as well. And we'll finish out the rest of the week in the same manner. It's just in an effort to get my review of Joker 2 to be a part of the podcast episode. And actually, as I'm recording this, I have not seen Joker 2. So I'm going to be, I'm recording the rest of the podcast right now, and then I'll be adding on my review of Joker 2 as after I see it. So that is that. I know it's a little bit more programming heavy to start out here, but just thought I'd give you guys an update. And before we get into any of the other topics that we're discussing here, if you haven't subscribed to the Access Blockbusters YouTube channel, make sure to do so. Give this video a like if you're watching and listening on YouTube, and let me know what you think about the podcast. And if you are listening on Spotify, thank you so much. This podcast is available on Spotify, and so make sure to go check it out there if you prefer the audio-only version. All right, guys, let us get into all these topics. All right, guys, in the world of unexpected, let's talk about a Bane and Deathstroke movie. Yeah, that's actually happening according to all of the major sources in the Hollywood industry, the movie news industry. And I have some thoughts about this. And even though we don't have that many details, I do think the one little piece of information that was snuck in here that these news sources like Deadline have been reporting is interesting, actually not even for DC, but for Marvel, surprisingly. So let's talk about this Bane Deathstroke movie. So it has been reported by, again, all the major trades that there is in development from DC Studios as part of the DCU, it looks like, although I don't think officially confirmed that that's the case. Who knows? Maybe it's part of the Batman universe. I highly doubt it. But let's just go into the assumption, I think a very safe assumption, that this Bane Deathstroke movie is going to be a part of the DCU, which we'll talk about, which makes some sense as it lines up with the theme of Chapter 1 of the DCU. But it has been announced that a Bane and Deathstroke movie is in development. Now, for those of you who are not aware, I'm sure most of you are aware of Bane, probably, even those of you who have not been following comic books and comic book movies. Bane was the main villain in The Dark Knight Rises, played by Tom Hardy. He's the guy who wears the mask. And in the comics, he usually has the bigger mask. He's usually even bigger, kind of monstrous, gargantuan size. If those of you who have been watching Kite Man or Harley Quinn, he's played, he's one of the more comedic characters in that show, but he comes off as very funny, but usually he's quite intimidating. He has literal venom in his veins. And so he's quite an interesting character because there's room for dimensionality, right, with a character like Bane. And we saw some of it explored a little bit in The Dark Knight Rises with his relationship with Talia al Ghul. But there's also the side of Bane that can be very comedic, and, we see that in Harley Quinn, but even more so than comedic, because usually he's not a comedy character other than your Batman and Robins, for example. You have a more brooding, hulking kind of, not to say he's a brute necessarily, but he's a character that can be a physical presence even more so than he is verbose, for example. I think the Tom Hardy version went for a more, obviously Tom Hardy was incredibly, incredibly well built and fit for that movie, but I think even more so they wanted to develop him as a character, obviously with his time in the pit and whatnot. But Bane is an interesting character because he can fit a lot of different roles. There's actually a lot of area for some nuanced character development with Bane. So there is that. Now, Deathstroke, Slade Wilson, and if that name sounds familiar for those of you who have been following the MCU, that is, I think Deathstroke actually came first, Slade Wilson, and then Deadpool was a parody of that with Wade Wilson. But Slade Wilson is a mercenary. He is one of the bigger Batman villains, and I should mention that, with Bane being in The Dark Knight Rises, Bane is also part of the Batman Rogues Gallery. So Bane and Deathstroke both, although both have obviously appeared with other superheroes and alongside other supervillains before, but Deathstroke is a mercenary. He looks sort of like, he's more of like an assassin version of Deadpool. I know that, like I said, Slade Wilson, I think, came first, but just to give a frame of reference here. And yeah, I mean, not a lot. I don't know a whole ton about the character, but he did make a brief appearance in both the theatrical cut of Justice League and the Snyder cut of Justice League in the post-credit scene where he was met by Lex Luthor. He was, I believe, going to be the main antagonist for the Ben Affleck Batman movie. And he is, he's a part of the Batman Rogues Gallery. He's a pretty big part of it as well. So this is interesting, right? Now, that's the breaking news. But let's actually talk about some of the implications here. One for the DCU and one actually for the MCU in an interesting way. As I'll, touch upon the other little piece of news that was released with this whole story. So for the DCU, right? Here are a couple takeaways. One being, this is part of the chapter known as Gods and Monsters, right? And I don't know too much about Deathstroke in terms of gods and monsters. I'm not entirely sure where he fits in that paradigm, but Bane seems like a very interesting character to fit in there because while he's not necessarily a monster, or he's not, clearly not a god in the DCU, he kind of fits the mold of maybe a more tragic character, right? I think that there's a side of him that can be monstrous, but maybe less monstrous and more misunderstood as a character. And so where he fits into the gods and monsters theme, I'm not entirely sure, but I think that Bane could be an interesting character to explore here as well. Deathstroke, like I said, not entirely sure if he fits in with that scheme, but maybe James Gunn thought he would be a very fun character to pair with Bane. I also think it's notable that they are making an entire separate film, not a TV show, not even them appearing in Brave and the Bold, but having an entirely separate film just dedicated to Bane and Deathstroke. It seems to me that these two characters would then become a much larger part of the DCU, right? And it's, what else is interesting is now we're getting a little bit more of the landscape of Gods and Monsters. The first chapter of the DCU, for those of you who are unaware, it's sort of like the MCU's phase 1 is the equivalent of the DCU's chapter 1, I suppose. And it looks like, there's not, like I've been saying, there's not infinite space, right? Unfortunately for James Gunn, to have as many movies as you want about as many characters as you want. And just like the MCU has been seeing lately, oversaturation with their TV shows is not always the best thing. So I would imagine James Gunn's a very thoughtful person. I'm sure he's looking at the MCU and trying to learn from their mistakes as well, and also learn from the mistakes of the DCEU. it's interesting to me that, you have your established characters showing up. Obviously, you start with Superman, you're going to get Supergirl, you're going to have Batman, you're going to have Wonder Woman, maybe, although maybe not with Paradise Lost, which is an HBO Max show. You're going to have Green Lantern with lanterns, and no sign of Aquaman, Cyborg, Flash. But, you're going to have some of your main characters. Even characters like Booster Gold or Blue Beetle will show up, right? These are sort of A and B, like lower B tier characters, but, characters that are much more well known. But then the more we hear about the later plans of the DCU, so we're moving past now the initial chunk of movies, even, Swamp Thing, for example, then we're getting some interesting films. I just talked about Sergeant Rock, which is a character I had never heard of before. And obviously more people would have heard of Bane, especially because of The Dark Knight Rises, and Deathstroke. But again, we don't have infinite time here, and I don't anticipate the DCU releasing 10 films a year, right? So I find it interesting that James Gunn is intentionally choosing to focus on these characters, because it certainly seems to indicate that these characters will be a very important part of the DCU moving forward, which I find very interesting. The other thing, though, that I wanted to talk about here, because there is one more little bit of news that comes along with the Bane and Deathstroke movie announcement, at least, rumored announcement, is the writer. So it's actually been reported that the writer of this film is somebody named Matthew Orton. Now, Matthew Orton, his name sounded somewhat familiar to me, and sure enough, in the article, as I read it, there's a reason why. Matthew Orton is actually one of the writers for Captain America: Brave New World. Now, he doesn't have, I believe he doesn't have a whole ton of other credits from this, for other than Captain America: Brave New World. At least I didn't see from the initial reporting. But the reason that I think this is interesting from an MCU perspective is that, James Gunn is pretty particular with his writers, right? And I don't think he would just pick a random person, like the Madam Web writers who also wrote Morbius. I don't think James Gunn would just be like, oh yeah, you guys can write a DCU movie. No, I think he's probably very particular in the people that he's choosing to write and produce these movies. And so I think it's interesting that he picked someone like Matthew Orton, who is just coming off of Captain America: Brave New World. Now, James Gunn himself has probably not seen Captain America: Brave New World. I'm sure he and Kevin Feige are close, but I don't think at this point Kevin Feige is inviting James Gunn over to see test screenings of Captain America: Brave New World, right? I don't think that's the case. But what I think this indicates here is that James Gunn looked at Matthew Orton and trusted his profile, saw some of his writing that he really liked. Maybe even Matthew Orton wrote a preliminary script for James Gunn, and it was something that James Gunn was a fan of. So I know Captain America: Brave New World went through a lot of rewrites, but this actually gives me some hope, because I would assume that Matthew Orton is one of the writers who helped pitch into the new shaping of the film. And I actually think that this is good news for Captain America: Brave New World, and it seems like it will be a good sign that this film is headed in a good direction. So actually, both good news for the MCU and the DCU. In terms of, just to wrap up this news about the Bane and Deathstroke movie, I remain very curious about a roadmap for this DCU. James Gunn absolutely does not have to announce the Justice League or Justice Society or whatever movie he wants to do at the end of Chapter 1 at this point. But it is curious, because you're trying to trace some kind of through line story here. Again, there doesn't necessarily have to be one. For the MCU's Phase 1, it was just introducing Iron Man and Captain America, Black Widow, Hawkeye, Hulk, and Thor. So it wasn't necessarily, a roadmap, but you started to see the pieces line up with Loki, and Infinity Stones eventually started to pop up. So I'd be very curious to see if there is a roadmap here that it starts to appear with gods and monsters. But I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments down below. What do you think of a Bane and Deathstroke movie? Is this something that you'd be interested in seeing, or maybe something that you're not interested at all in watching? Let me know in the comments down below. All right, guys, so let's talk about a movie that I'm sure a lot of you guys have not seen. I said this about Transformers 1 last week, but I think even less of you will have seen The Wild Robot. And this is going to be a little bit of a shorter segment, because I will not be doing a spoiler discussion of The Wild Robot, because I simply don't think a lot of you guys have seen it. And so, I know that this is coming out a couple weeks after the movie has come out. But I do hope that if any of you are out there and you are on the fence, and maybe you have one of those subscriptions to AMC or Cinemark, it is my wholehearted recommendation that you go see The Wild Robot. And I'm going to give some reasons why, and perhaps those will help persuade you to go check out the movie, because I do think it is well worth checking out. So I know that, again, a lot of you guys will probably have not seen the film and probably had very little interest in seeing this film. I, myself, didn't have super high expectations for it before the initial reviews were coming out. But once the initial reviews came out, it sold me to at least check it out, and I am so glad that I did. And if anyone out there, even one person out there watches this video and is convinced to go check out the movie, I would be so happy and so thrilled if that were the case. So, again, non-spoiler review of The Wild Robot. I'd love to just get a chance to talk about a film that I really enjoyed. So The Wild Robot is an animated film from Dreamworks, which Dreamworks, I think, last did Puss in Boots: The Last Wish, and that was received incredibly well. But they're not, especially in terms of box office. I mean, Inside Out 2 making $1.6 billion. You're not going to see that, unfortunately, from a film like The Wild Robot. In fact, I'm recording this before a lot of the numbers have come out from the opening weekend, and I just don't expect this film to do quite well at the box office. And that's a shame, because it deserves to do really well. It deserves to make $1 billion. If Inside Out 2 can make $1 billion, it deserves to make $1 billion, but it won't. Unfortunately, it won't. And I do encourage, if you guys can help the film out, and then spread word of mouth, I think that'd be great, because it's a smaller film. It's a film that was not, to be fair, marketed as heavily as something like Inside Out 2. I remember seeing a couple trailers for this movie and thinking it looks okay. It looks kind of cute. I never ever liked, in fairness to the to people who are maybe skeptical about the film, I never liked those lines that were included at the end of the trailer where Lupita Nyong'o's character goes, "I am a wild robot." And I go, okay, so it's one of those movies where it's just kind of so obvious and for kids and over the top. But like I said, I watched, or I read a lot of reviews, and I realized that, well, a lot of critics were saying this is sort of a Pixar level film. It had a 98% on Rotten Tomatoes, I think. And that's usually enough to convince me to go, okay, all right, let's go check it out. And so I did. And here's what I will say. This film, obviously I'm being facetious when I say this, but this film is not for kids. And I say that as somebody who is not a kid right now, but obviously was once a kid and watched these animated films. I grew up watching Pixar, like I've said many times on this channel. And I am continually amazed as I rewatch some of these Pixar films. And who knows, maybe we'll do a big Pixar rewatch once we're done with the DCE rewatch. But I'm continually amazed at just how these movies, especially the more profound and deeper ones, are made for adults, made by adults for adults, that also have enough flashy fun for kids to learn something about. The Wild Robot is one of those movies. I actually think this might, and perhaps this will not make any sense to anybody here who has not seen the film. But if you have seen the film, maybe you'll understand what I'm talking about. As I was watching this film, I actually thought the audience that would resonate the most with a film like this are parents. And not just parents, but parents who have perhaps teenagers, or even kids who are just going to college or moving out, or things like that, where you have parents who are adjusting to a new reality of trying to watch their kids grow up. And that's obviously not something that kids could grasp. So in that regard, it is very much like a Pixar film, in the sense that it is grasping and tackling these incredibly deep and profound themes, while also having a lot of entertainment value. I'm going to be very, very vague with these plot details, because I hope that you can go into the film and enjoy it as much as you can without knowing a lot of what happens. But I mean, the main general premise is that there is a robot that is designed by a company that ends up somehow on this island. And this robot, again voiced by Lupita Nyong'o, is basically forced to adapt to the island in a certain sense. And she meets a lot of really interesting characters along the way. There are a couple other big A-list actors that are doing voices here. Actually, one of the co-leads, I'll say, of the film is voiced by somebody that I didn't even recognize his voice throughout the film, because he did such a good job, and that's a credit to him. If you haven't, if you want to check out the cast list, I'm sure you'll be able to know who it is as soon as you see the list, because he's probably the biggest name aside from Lupita Nyong'o. But the credit goes to the voice cast here for giving incredible performances. But even aside from the deeper themes, and even aside from the profound messaging, it's also just a very entertaining film. It has a lot of entertainment value where you're not entertained necessarily by the shooting things and bright explosions and things like that, but more so just the journey that these characters go on. It's fun. It's funny. There are some really good quips in there. There's some good one-liners and some good gags, that visual gags, and things that will appeal to children, but also I laughed a couple times. They're actually, one of the things that surprised me about this film also is that it was really sharply written. There's a group of, I'm not going to say too much about them, but there's a group of young children characters in this film that say some of the funniest things that I've ever heard that will probably make kids laugh, but also will go right over their heads at just how funny they are. I was laughing consistently whenever these small children characters were coming on screen, which sounds crazy. You'll know exactly what I mean once you see the film. But on top of so it's entertaining, even for people who are not kids, for adults. It's incredibly entertaining, and it's also, like I said, it has really profound themes that are simple and yet sweet. I found myself being on the verge of tears. Not crying necessarily, not like Pixar, Coco, Inside Out, sobbing, kind of thing, La La Land epilogue sobbing, but more just on, tears in my eyes because of how a few of these storylines that were playing out were played so genuinely and so impactfully that you could feel what exactly these writers were going for when they were, having these moments between characters. And it's at a certain point, you do know exactly where this film is going. It's not like it's trying to hide the big emotional climax at the end, but there are also surprises in there as well. Because, you think the direction of the film just based on, okay, this you've seen this kind of before, but it has, I don't know if you guys have read any Dr. Seuss. I remember also growing up reading a lot of Dr. Seuss, and it has a lot of shades of some of my favorite Dr. Seuss books when I was a kid, of characters who are so good-hearted and genuine and show you that there are good people in this world no matter what, and show you that who you are is not necessarily who you think you should be, without, again, revealing the entire movie's message. Because I could, if enough of you guys want it, I can definitely do an analysis of the film and its messages, because I think there's so much in here that can be discussed and should be talked about. So, but anyways, going back to Dr. Seuss, it reminded me in particular of a couple of those books that I read. I read almost all of them when I was a kid. And definitely it reminded me of Thidwick. I don't know if you guys have read those books. This might just be complete nonsense for some of you because you haven't read Dr. Seuss books, but there was a book called Thidwick. It was a moose who really cared for a lot of animals that were around him. And I haven't read these books, obviously, for many, many, many years, but these books were so impactful because they still stuck with me. So Thidwick was one, and then there's the very famous Horton Hears a Who that was made into an animated film and whatnot. But there's another book that was written by Dr. Seuss called Horton Hatches an Egg that also was equally sweet and genuine from what I remember, at least. And this film reminded me of both of those books in particular. It had the whimsy and had the fun of seeing those bombastic visuals of Dr. Seuss, but also the really sweet heart at the center. I know it's kind of weird for me to be talking about Dr. Seuss in a review of The Wild Robot, but I want to intentionally keep a lot of the details of the film hidden because that's how I went into the film, just having seen a couple trailers. You see the robot, you see the animals, and there's something going on there. But I would really encourage you guys, if you are interested, if you enjoy those movies where you feel good and you, not to steal Nicole Kidman's ad, but where heartbreak kind of feels good in a place like this, but not bad heartbreak, right? Really heartbreak that is, followed by triumphs and with love and with joy, and a film that will make you laugh. I laughed a few times, especially with a few characters in particular, and is entertaining. And, at the end of the day, if you don't really connect with the themes, I think it's still just a really well-made movie that's beautifully animated, by the way. If nothing else, you could definitely walk into the film and look at an animated film that is beautiful to look at and really a visual spectacle for the eyes. So I would highly recommend, if you have the time, the money, the capacity to watch The Wild Robot. I know that there are other films coming out in the coming days and weeks, Joker, Folie à Deux, and Saturday Night, and Venom, and all these films that are coming out in the next couple of months, Moana 2. But I think that if you have kids, if you are a parent, or even if you're not, this is a film that I think will resonate very deeply and strongly with you. So I ask you guys, if you have seen The Wild Robot, what did you think of it? Do you think that this or Inside Out 2 is a better movie? It doesn't really matter. They're both amazing, in my opinion. They both deal with and tackle very adult and real themes while being wonderful, entertaining kids movies. And if you haven't seen it, are you interested in checking it out? I would, again, highly recommend it. Let me know in the comments down below. All right, let's talk episode 2 of The Penguin. Now, The Penguin is the latest show to be coming out. Actually, latest. It's one of the first shows to be coming out of this new DC regime. And to be fair, this has been a show that's been in development for a long time, so it's not like it's coming out specifically from James Gunn. This is really purely from the mind of Matt Reeves and his universe. But after the success of the Batman movie with Robert Pattinson, we were going to be getting a couple spin-off shows from that universe, and The Penguin was going to be the first one. So the first episode came out last week, and I just thought, look, it's not the kind of show that I typically seek out. It's definitely not. I'm not generally the biggest, fan of these crime mafia kind of dramas, but I would be lying if I told you, and you can go check out last week's episode of the podcast, that I would be lying if I said anything other than I thought the first episode was incredible in so many different ways. And you can, again, go check out the last week's podcast episode, or the last segment that we did about Penguin episode 1. But we're here to talk about Penguin episode 2. I know just by nature of how these segments and the podcasts are released that it'll be coming out actually pretty close to episode 3. So hopefully this will be just sort of a big refresher, if you will, of episode 2 before we head into episode 3. And hopefully that'll be helpful for you guys as well. So let's talk episode 2 of The Penguin. This is going to be a full spoiler discussion. If you have not seen the episode ahead of episode 3 that's coming out very soon, make sure to just save this video to watch it later, and then come back once you've seen episode 2. And let's get into it. I've taken notes as usual, and I have a lot of things to say, as just like with the other episode of The Penguin. So I think one of the interesting things that we're seeing here in this second episode is I don't know if it's an attempt to humanize Sophia Falcone, but it's definitely an attempt to give us a better understanding of her mental, what's going on in her head, her mental state, I guess, or simply the kinds of experiences that she had to go through in Arkham that shaped who and how she is as a person now. So you have obviously her experiences with Arkham, in general, but then you also, which are hinted at towards the beginning in this, I guess, therapy scene or this sort of flashback sequence that she's experiencing at the very beginning of the episode. But then you also have the trauma of simply losing her brother, who it seems like she was very close to, Alberto Falcone. And I think those two things, because in the first episode, what I think was really interesting is that we got a very cold, very calculating version of this character, Sophia Falcone. But episode 2 starts immediately with peeling back the layers just a little bit. And I think that that's interesting. I wonder how far we're going to go. And by the end of the episode, we get sort of the fully realized version of this character's arc, and that she's going to try to topple her own family hierarchy and become the kingpin at the top, which mirrors Oz's trajectory, or the trajectory that he wants to ascend to with the gang war that's going on here. So I think that's really interesting. And I'd be curious to see how they dive into Sophia Falcone's psyche a little bit more as we head on in to the series, because it is true that she's gone through some very traumatic things, even though she is in essence a serial killer, just a kind of a mob boss, or an aspiring mob boss, and she's done some really crazy, terrible things. But again, like I said last week, one of the things that I wanted to see in a show like this, where we're dealing with characters that are generally villainous and generally very despicable, is not necessarily sympathy for them, but more just understanding what they're doing and how they're going about it. So I think that is also really interesting there. Then we have more of Penguin just causing a mess, because at the end of episode 1, we saw that Penguin Oz blamed the death of Alberto Falcone on the Maronis. And so we have a direct continuation of that here, where he heads back to talk to Clancy Brown's Sal Maroni, and he is basically saying, look, take the blame for it, and I'll give you what you want, which is messing up that drop that the Falcones were going to go get, which the Penguin also told the Falcones, I believe in episode 1, that he was going to deliver for them. So it's all this back and forth where he being Oz, the Penguin, is in the middle of, but he obviously is not in a position to tell either side, and we'll talk about what I think is going to be going on, or sort of the consequences of his plans as we move along through the episode, because I think this is a big part of what this show is Oz telling one side of the gang war, the Falcones, for example, one thing, and then going back to the Maronis and telling them the exact opposite thing, and then blaming the other side for what he allegedly said. And it just goes back and forth. It's such a rich premise that leads to such chaos and such a high wire act that I think is such great tension and really good, well-written television. So I think that that's interesting. Then we get a scene here with Sophia Falcone as she is talking to other members of her family, and then Penguin tries to talk to her and says, look, I'll be there for you, you know? And that's, you know, adding on top of what I was saying earlier, that's another really dangerous game to be playing, because Sophia Falcone, I think it's interesting that she, at this point in the show, doesn't really suspect Oz, although maybe she has been the whole time. I'm sure that in the back of her mind, some alarm bells are going off every time she talks to Oz. So maybe part of the, skipping ahead to the very end, part of the reason that she wants him to be a part of her operation is just to keep him close. Not sure, but, you know, either way, it's inevitable she's going to find out sooner rather than later what Oz has been up to. And it's a dangerous, dangerous game, what Oz is doing. You know, trying to play Sophia Falcone, and I think that that's definitely something to keep an eye out for. We get a scene here where Oz is talking with you know, some of his friends here, female and male alike. Obviously, just trying to keep the channel more on the appropriate side, so not going to go into too much detail here. Although I will say the cilantro joke that he says, where Vic forgets to take out the cilantro in the tacos, I think it was, or the food that they were eating, was really funny to me, because I am one of those people. Just like Oz, I guess that's one thing, hopefully one of the only things that Oz and I have in common, is that cilantro tastes like soap to me as well. So I think the joke where he says, "Are you kidding me? Do you want this entire plate of food to taste like soap?" I thought actually was quite funny. I don't know if any of you guys also thought or understood what was going on there, because I know that a lot of people love cilantro. Anyways, not to talk about cilantro for the rest of the episode, but I just wanted to point that out as something that was funny for me. And so, on that note of Vic, I continue to be very impressed with the fact that I am buying more into this sub storyline of Vic and Oz training. I don't want to call him a protege, because I think Vic at this point in the show doesn't want to be Penguin's protege. I mean, the things that he's had to do and the reluctance and the failures that he has gone through. At this point, what are his options, right? He can't leave because he knows about Penguin's entire operation. And so if he leaves, he's dead. And he knows that. And I think that I just continue to be impressed with this dynamic, because it's not something that I thought I'd wanted. You know, I would never have told you before this Penguin show, oh, I want Penguin to be walking around with a young adult man, training him to be, you know, part of his operation. I would have been like, I don't know if that's a great idea. Feels like it would be kind of fillery or dragging down the show, but it shows so much of a different side of Oz. It reveals a side to him that I think deep down wants to impress upon people the kinds of lessons that he's learned, and maybe that's a part of his own insecurities as well, with his own traumatic family upbringing as well. And I think that is a storyline that I'm continuing to be impressed by with every scene that Vic is in. Also, just the humanity that a character like Vic brings to the show, with how scared he is and the stutter and the understandable inability to commit crimes when that's not what what he's known. It's just something, it's the life that he's been living with Oz thus far. So then we get a scene where Sophia confronts a detective that used to work for Carmine Falcone. Again, another really interesting detail to flesh out the world of this Batman universe, where apparently half of the force was under Carmine Falcone's payroll. Again, very interesting. And yeah, I mean, the investigation work, it makes total sense. We got to figure out who this inside man is. It's obviously Oz, but we got to figure it out. And Sophia just trying to get to the bottom of this, it creates more and more tension, right? Because now, whether or not we like it, at least for me, I'm rooting for Oz to get out of it, but also knowing that he's going to totally going to be caught at a certain point. And that's a dangerous game. And it just, the tension is continuing to ratchet up here. So anyways, going back to Vic, we also get a scene where Vic gets a text from somebody asking if he's okay. And that is something that I want the show to continue to explore, because it's something that I had been thinking about as well, of wondering, is there anyone out there for Vic who really cares about him and is wondering where he's been all this time, because he's been gone for quite a while. And so I think that I wonder what that will turn into. 50-50 for me right now as to whether he makes it out of the show, which would be really tragic if he didn't. Really just such a tragic ending for that character. But I'm hoping that he also gets to see whoever it is that he wants to see, whether it's his family, a loved one, because I think that a character like this just to keep getting berated by Oz and other people. I mean, Oz isn't berating him, although that scene in the graveyard was kind of brutal, but just living a life that I don't think he wants to live is something that I hope that he can get some semblance of peace there. Anyways, Oz is also in possession of some incriminating photos of Johnny Vitti. So that's another interesting thing that comes into play later on. That's how he gets out of a little bit of a jam with the Maronis. Very interesting. He also visits his mother. So not only fleshing out Sophia Falcone and her traumatic upbringing, or not upbringing, but her trauma, but also talking about Oz. Apparently his mother's condition is not doing so. She's not doing so well. And I think that that's also something that will be playing a big role in some of the motivations of Penguin, because it looks like part of the reason that he's doing what he's doing is for his mother. And whether or not you think that's messed up or not, because obviously their dynamic is kind of messed up based on what we saw in episode 1, it's still something where it is a motivation for this character, and I think that it will continue to pay off as we go along here. Again, just another way for this show to create more dimensionality to characters that just didn't have any. I mean, if you had told me all the things that we'd be learning about Oz in, when I went to see the Batman for the first time, I would just be so amazed and kind of in disbelief, because that character that we see in the Batman is really compelling in his own way. He's a sidekick, to Carmine Falcone, but all these things that we're learning about him it's incredible. And he gives a little bit more of this backstory to Sophia Falcone at the funeral, although part of me wonders how much of this he's making up and how much of it is true. What he says is really tragic about his brothers dying and his mother being in such grief, but I do wonder, how much of this is fabricated and how much of this is manipulation, right? So that he can get in the good graces of Sophia Falcone, which again I mentioned is a very, very dangerous game to be playing. So there is that. We then get a scene where basically the Maronis find out that he basically screwed up the whole operation with the truck and everything like that. And so then, he also, the fact that one of their guys is missing because the detective found one of the Maronis. Or I guess I should back up a little bit, because what happens first is that the detective finds the Maroni and he holds him hostage. And then we have the scene, I think, with the truck and with the failed drop. And then we get the scene. I could be wrong. I could have those events in slightly different order. But just talking about generally the sequence of events here, where Oz is in trouble with the Maronis. And then he pulls out that incriminating information about Luca, or about Johnny Vitti having, cheating with Luca's wife. And I think that, again, my question here is really... And this is not a question about the show's quality, more just about the story, but it continues to be a dangerous game, and I just wonder how much longer can Oz talk and scheme his way out of things? Because every single time he does it, and he does it one more time in a very grand way at the end of this episode, where he kills the Maroni guy, and you go, I mean, who and what is happening? Who is not going to be upset about this? And maybe that's the point. That is the point, right? Where he is continuing to escalate the Falcones and the Maronis' angst and anger towards one another. But at a certain point, he's going to be found out. And as he continues to escalate these plots, it's going to be worse and worse and worse and worse for him. And I'm sure that is the point at the end. But I'd be super curious to see, once he is found out, because I think that is an inevitability, what he's going to do to get out of all of this. Because right now, he is playing such a high wire act, and he's barely getting out of these situations. It's so tense, which is what I love about this kind of show, is the tension that is building every single scene, because you know that he could be caught at any moment, and he is caught in certain moments, but how does he get out of those situations? Like at the end of episode 1, how did he get out of that? And then here when he's talking to the Maroni woman, and she's interrogating him, it's like, how is he going to get out of that? So it's just really great to see how... just how the writers are manipulating these characters and making them go in different directions that make total and complete sense. Then we go back to the Falcone house, and Sophia. By the way, Sophia having to watch videos of her and her brother is just a crazy thing. It must have been so traumatic and triggering for her, and I just can't imagine that, even for a normal person, let alone Sophia Falcone. So it's that was kind of a scene where I felt that a little bit. It was a really sad thing. And then we get the scene where Oz, because Vic fails to plant the jewels in the car, Oz has to then kill the Maroni. And it wasn't as shocking maybe as some of the things that happened in episode 1, but it was certainly another moment where I went, well, this show just completely surprised me one more time, because now I guess we're escalating the gang war, but also Oz, how is he just going to keep getting away with this? Eventually, the bill comes due, and also even later on, that guy getting framed where he has the knife that Oz has, and Oz plants the knife on him. I thought for sure it would have been Johnny Vitti who would have gotten killed, but it turns out to be the other guy. And I'm sure that, Oz, because Oz doesn't seem to like Johnny Vitti very much. And so I'm sure that there will be some kind of confrontation there. But the ending as well, where Sophia calls him, and who knows how suspicious Sophia Falcone is of Oz in this particular moment. I'm sure that her suspicions are getting larger and larger. But how much she knows and how much she's suspecting remains to be seen. It's a very, I think under the surface, what we're not seeing is that Sophia is also playing a game here, and I'm sure that she knows a lot more than she's letting on. And that last line too about "Let's dance," what that Oz says to Sophia as she offers him a place in her empire, I think is such a great callback to that backstory that he was telling her about dancing with his mom after his brothers died. So again, another episode that just continues to surprise me and captivate me in a way that I just was not expecting from a show like this, because all these different storylines that are going on continue to ratchet up the stakes and ratchet up the tension for a character like Oz, who, yes, is continuing to get out of it somehow. By the end of the episode, he is still somehow vaguely in the good graces of the Falcones and the Maronis. Not really. He's somewhat in the poor graces of both, I suppose, but not enough to be considered a suspect. But the bill has to come due. And I'm so curious to hear and to find out when and where that will happen, because it's going to happen. And I'm just so interested to find out. It continues to be such a captivating show, and I can't wait for episode 3. So guys, what did you think about The Penguin episode 2? Let me know in the comments down below. Did you think it was better than episode 1? On par? Worse? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to continue the discussion there. All right, Agatha All Along is now almost halfway done with its run. Isn't that crazy? It is what it is with these very short Disney Plus series where you only have 8 or 9 episodes. And to be fair, shows like The Penguin or shows like The Boys or Rings of Power only have 8 or 9 episodes as well. The difference, obviously, is that there's twice as much content with those shows, because Agatha All Along continues to have 30 to 35 minute episodes, while The Penguin has consistently hour-long episodes. All that being said, we are about, I'd say, 40 to 45% through with the show, and it's time to talk about episode 4. So this is going to be a full spoiler discussion of episode 4 of Agatha All Along. If you have not seen episode 4, make sure to just save this segment or the entire podcast. If you're listening to the entire podcast, you can skip around to different segments in the time codes in the description down below. And make sure to come back and revisit once you have seen the episode. All right, guys, this is your final spoiler warning. Let's get into Agatha All Along. So just to give, as I always do at the beginning of these segments, a little bit of a recap of my thoughts on previous episodes, in case you haven't checked out my previous segments in previous podcasts. I was somebody who was a little bit skeptical, to say the least, about a show like Agatha All Along. I thought, well, she was a fine, charismatic presence in WandaVision, one of my favorite MCU movies or shows of all time, but I just didn't see what warranted an entire spin-off show for her. Flash forward to the beginning of the show, and I watched episodes 1 and 2, and I thought, this is very entertaining. I had a great time with the first couple episodes. Episode 3, like I mentioned last week, revealed the format, right? It revealed the format of, okay, so pretty much kind of what I feared. Every episode is going to be a different trial on the Witch's Road. It's going to be like that probably until episode 8, and then midway through or at the end of episode 8, the big bad is revealed, and episode 9 is going to be some kind of confrontation. It is what it is. It's going to be the format, unless they decide to completely deviate in the next couple episodes, but I doubt it. I seriously doubt it. Okay, that being said, because I was apprehensive about that, because, look, I got someone who commented in the last episode, like when I was talking about episode 3 of Agatha All Along, saying, so basically what I'm hearing is that you're afraid this is going to be a TV show. And to that I responded, that is I think a very, one way to put it is what I will say. But in reality, what I think it is it's a little more nuanced, because I think with TV shows made in the traditional format, right, where they were 22-minute episodes, right? Any sitcom, like my favorite show, Friends, for example, 22-minute episodes, right? It's crazy. It's very short. But they were spanning across 20 to 25 episodes per season, which means that within each format, you are allowed to have your own concept, do whatever you want, spend time with the characters, while slowly building up an overall story. Some episodes don't have to deal with the overall story. Some episodes do. Usually most of them hint at it at any given rate. So with a show like Agatha All Along, what I was worried about is that, okay, we only have 9 episodes. The episodes are still short. They're still 35 minutes. And just to have kind of a meandering, just a show that depends on the format, where the overall arcing story is kind of taking a backseat until the very end, it worried me a little bit. So anyways, I liked episode 3. I thought the format it revealed itself, and I liked episode 3 just because I thought the execution of episode 3 was pretty good. Now, we moved to episode 4, and just like last week, we move into a different trial of the Witch's Road, and I'm going to say up front, I didn't like episode 4. And I think it comes down to one very simple thing. There's a reason that I was building up all this context for you guys, just in my own personal, for my own personal opinions about this show, is because this show now, for me at least, entirely depends on how well each week's format works. And this week, unlike last week, the format didn't work for me, because the execution of that format, and we're going to talk about what that is, the format, the formula, if you will, that they've been setting up, it just came out to a product that I didn't enjoy. Because you can take that same format and you can do a lot of different things with it, which hence I thought episode 3, for the most part, I didn't love it, but I liked it, was entertaining. Episode 4 took that same concept, took the same formula, put a little bit of a twist on it, and I just happened to not like it. So we'll go through the entire episode, not necessarily going through every single little detail, but just going through a lot of the little details and some of the story things that I was noticing along the way, and then I'll talk about my disappointment with the episode at the end and why I think that doesn't necessarily mean episode 5 is going to be bad, but it also doesn't mean it's good. It just means it is what it is. Whatever episode 5 happens to be, it will be, what it is, and then we'll move on from there until probably the finale when maybe Mephisto shows up. So we'll see. So anyways, let's dive into Agatha All Along, episode 4. One thing I noticed right off the bat as they are burying Sharon Davis is that I thought they weren't supposed to stray off the road, and I could be wrong. I wasn't, eagle-eyed looking exactly where they were burying the body, but it seemed like they were stepping off the road. Maybe it's just Sharon Davis because she is not a witch, but I was wondering a little bit why there weren't more consequences to burying Mrs. Davis, who is still referred to by everybody now as Mrs. Hart, which I think is kind of funny. But yeah, rest in peace, Sharon Davis. I will miss Deborah Jo Rupp. I think that she brought a little bit of a levity that they're trying to replace now with the chaotic, manic energy of Aubrey Plaza, which I think is fun. It's interesting. But I also think that a character like Sharon Davis brought a little bit of levity to an otherwise kind of bonkers, a little bit over-the-top show, I will say. So there is that. But Agatha, in the meantime, is being very callous because she clearly has no regard for the life of Mrs. Sharon Davis. And so that, just continuing to build her up as a character. I will say that for the most part, we're getting hints of Agatha's backstory, right? But we're not really getting hints of her as a three-dimensional character, because the only things that we're really getting is that she had some tragedy with her son, and then also she's a bad person. And look, those are 2 building blocks towards making a character more three-dimensional. But in the meantime, all we're getting so far is just her being manic and her being crazy, and also just some hinted at storyline and romance between her and Rio Vidal. Okay, it's all being hinted at. But for the time being, all we have to go off of is that she had a romance with Rio Vidal, probably. Not probably, definitely. And then she had something traumatic happen with her son, and also she's a bad person. Like these little moments at the beginning are just there to remind you, hey, don't forget, this is a bad person. And maybe she'll reform by the end of the show, but she doesn't care if you die. And I don't know, I just kind of wish that there was a little bit more dimensionality to this character. Not to just constantly compare things, because I want to enjoy this show on its own merits, but if you're watching The Penguin, right, they don't have to have Penguin come out and be like, oh, that's great that that guy's dead. He just goes out and does bad things while still having layers and layers of dimensionality to the character. And I just kind of wish that it was the same for Agatha, especially because we are now in episode 4 and heading into episode 5. But I digress anyways. All that to say, she is indeed being very callous, as I think Jennifer Kale points out. At this point, Teen suddenly wishes he could go home, which he's been so eager to be on the road the whole time that I guess somebody dying will do that to you. It feels like they're trying to tread this balance of treating Sharon Davis's death as a joke and as something very serious. And here in this moment, they want it to be very serious because Teen, I think, is understanding the gravity of walking the witch's road, which, is fine. But I think that they just could have picked a lane here, and they ultimately didn't. So, and also, like I alluded to before here, as they're finally getting ready to head over, or at least, call for the Green Witch before they head on to the next trial, the dialogue is very over the top. I'm not going to say it's, for me at least, in my personal opinion, I'm not going to say it's terrible dialogue, because I think that if you were to ask the writers, they were very intentionally going for this style of, oh, what do we do now? We have to, cast this spell. And okay, what does this spell do? I think that's part of what they think the charm is. And sometimes it works. Like sometimes when Catherine Hahn is being Catherine Hahn, charismatic as ever, I think it works. Sometimes, though, it just comes off as very stilted, very corny, very over the top. And I think in this episode especially, there were a lot of moments where Catherine Hahn was like, okay, what's next? And then, Witch would be like, well, we have to cast the spell. And then they're like, great, let's cast the spell. What do we need to do to cast the spell? And I think that, again, it's part of the style of the show. I'm not saying that it's not. I'm not saying like a writer was trying to write Shakespeare and ended up writing this. It's not at all what I'm saying. I'm just saying that for me, it got a little bit grating as the episode went on. I will say, though, going back to one of the things I loved about episode 3 was the sudden shift into horror, Rio Vidal coming out of the ground. Oh, that was creepy. I'm not super well versed into horror, and I don't necessarily intend on being super well versed into horror. It's just not my thing. So if you are a horror fan and you saw that and you were like, yeah, that's lame. That's not that great. Okay, totally respect that. I understand where you're coming from. Also would love if you understood where I'm coming from. That to me freaked me out. So that's all I'm saying. Anyways, we are getting some hints of a backstory here at the beginning of the episode between Rio and Agatha, and that will get fleshed out towards the end. So we'll talk about that at the end of this segment. And then we head into this disco recording studio kind of setup here. I don't know what this is intended to parody specifically, other than just being a kind of an 80s style recording studio. But it's there. And obviously they get all their costume changes. So this is the formula, right? And I wanted to talk a little bit here, like I mentioned at the beginning, about this I guess cycle that we're going to head into every single episode, right? Every single episode I think is going to be following a similar in a similar vein to the previous one. And I want to talk about that very briefly here. So here's the thing, right? Because I was thinking about this as this episode was going on, and I think what I've come to the realization of, for me at least, is that there's a difference between format and formula, right? Two very similar sounding words, obviously, but format and formula, I think, are two different things. And I think Agatha all along, so far, it's only been two episodes of this kind of episode, because episodes 1 and 2 were a little bit different, but still, I can't imagine that the next episode isn't going to be similar to this episode and episode 3. But I think Agatha all along is following a formula and not a format. So what I mean by format is this. Let's take a show, and it doesn't have to be a sitcom. I was thinking, I always think in terms of sitcoms because I watched a lot of sitcoms and I love them. But it doesn't have to be a sitcom. Let's just talk about any, serialized television show. Let's talk about one of my favorite shows, The West Wing, right? The West Wing has a format, right? So if you watch an episode of The West Wing, it's not strict, right? You don't know exactly what's going to happen, and some episodes mix it up, obviously, and some episodes, stick to this format pretty. I'm not going to say strictly, but they stick to the format. But you generally have an idea of what to expect. There's going to be multiple storylines running of different characters dealing with different things in the government, in Congress, and with the president and whatnot. Usually the president has a hand in one of these storylines, and other characters are either dealing with a crisis or whatnot. So there's a general format. And usually by the end of it, either it ends in a kind of, not tragedy per se, but, ends in a kind of ambiguous, unresolved state in some episodes, or in some other episodes, there's a very hopeful ending. And you kind of know what to expect with that format, right? But The West Wing, what The West Wing doesn't do is it doesn't adhere to a formula. So it's not like literally every single episode, it's like, okay, let's just say the president does this in the first 10 minutes, and then this in the next 10 minutes, and then, another character like Toby will do this in the next, in minute 30 and whatnot. And I'm not saying that Agatha all along is following a formula to that extent. I'm just exaggerating just to kind of make my point clearer. But I do think that Agatha all along, at least with The Witch's Road, is straying closer to formula than to format, where I think every episode is going to be basically the same, with just I think the outside is going to look different, but the insides are going to be the exact same. What I mean by that is there's going to be a little bit at the beginning where they're on the witch's road. They're going to have some kind of argument. They're going to do something. Something interesting is going to happen. Maybe a little bit of a nugget, appears, like Rio Vidal is appearing at the beginning of this episode. Then they're going to go into some kind of house or some kind of trial, and they're going to basically have a timed trial, and something silly is going to happen, and maybe a couple horror things are going to happen, and they're going to have to rely on one another, and they're going to fight one another, and then they're going to reveal backstory about one another, and then at the end of it, there's going to be, they're going to escape, and maybe someone dies, and then there's going to be an exit, and they're going to escape. That's a formula. And look, I mean, it has the potential to work. I watched episode 3. I thought episode 3 was good. I enjoyed it because I think like I said, the inside is the formula. The exterior is whatever they decide to change up with it. And I think the shell of episode 3 was good. I enjoyed it. I will say the difference, though, between a format and a formula to me is that this formula can get old pretty quickly. And I think it already, for me personally, is starting to get a little bit old. Because I think, once you kind of understand exactly the mechanisms behind what's going on, and all of this, by the way, I admit all of this could be a moot point if episode 5 does something completely different. I'm just, again, my fears going into the show are starting to be realized that every single episode is going to kind of feel the same, just with a little bit of a different sheen on it, right? Last episode it was in this house where they were drinking wine and being, poisoned, and it was kind of a dinner party kind of scenario. This episode it was some kind of disco recording studio, musical, ballad, I don't even know. But still, the formula remains true. And so it's something that I want to keep an eye out for because, again, episode 5 can completely change my mind, but also I'm a little bit concerned that it's just going to be the same until the very end. Anyways, that is all. That is a big tangent, and let's get back to the actual episode. So as we head into this little studio, there's obviously a lot of tension, a lot more tension between Agatha and Rio. And I think that, I'm interested to see a little bit more of their dynamic as we head into future episodes. Although I'm a little frustrated, like I said, that we haven't gotten a lot yet, that we're just getting hints of it, but we'll see. I do think that once the trial begins, the way that room started to spin was really interesting. I think that is another fun kind of horror disconcerting moment here, and I like that. I'm not as big of a fan of the really stylized editing here, where you have different panes and different characters and split screens and whatnot. I think it's okay in moderation, but I think that they really went for it, and I applaud them for going for it here, but just didn't quite work well for me in this episode. And the other thing that started to bug me a little bit more in this episode is the way that magic is used, because they really subscribe to the old school kind of Harry Potter, Avada Kedavra, Expelliarmus, let's say Latin words, until it becomes magic kind of school of thought. And I think Harry Potter, what works so well about that is that you actually got attached to what those words were. And here, I just think it comes off as very silly that they're just saying Latin words, or words that even sound Latin. I don't even know if they're Latin words. And they're saying it in very American accents, so it doesn't even feel mystic at all. It just feels like Americans trying to say Latin words, and I don't know. It's not helping to add to the suspension of disbelief, I guess, if that makes sense. The premise of this episode is that Alice basically brought a generational curse to them, and guess what? They have to sing their way out of it. Look, I am so happy, and I mean this genuinely. If you love this episode, if you loved the execution of this, if you love the musical aspects of it, I'm so happy for you. I genuinely mean that. I'm just here to tell you my own personal thoughts, and this episode, for better or for worse, is just not for me. The way that they executed this formula in this episode, it is just simply not for me. And that's okay, right? I mean, episode 3 was enjoyable. Episode 5 could use the exact same formula, do something different, and it could be amazing. I don't know. This episode, though, as I was watching the musical part, I just went, I don't know what I'm watching here. I just can't quite comprehend. It almost felt like, in a dream, when you're seeing something that is 95% real and 5% of it is just off. I was watching this and I was going, I can't quite believe that this is part of the MCU somehow. And again, that doesn't mean every single thing of the MCU has to look the same or feel the same, look like Avengers Age of Ultron kind of thing. or Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness, to name a couple things that are maybe more MCU-ish, right? That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that I was watching this and this was just a tick too far off what I kind of, have the umbrella around the MCU, because I just never in a million years did I think I was going to see Catherine Hahn have to sing her way out of a witch trial in the Witch's Road. And I don't know, something about it just didn't quite work. Again, if it did for you, if the jam session did for you, I'm so happy. I really, really am. But it just didn't quite work for me. It wasn't not entertaining is what I will give it. But also, it just sometimes it kind of feels like it's just trying way too hard to be WandaVision. And you can get away with that, I think, if it works for you, right? Like episode 3, I acknowledge that, yeah, we're heading back into WandaVision territory. They're just basically using the same concept here by parroting other TV shows, and that's fine. But it just feels like if it doesn't work, then it feels like WandaVision without any of the depth that it had to it. And I don't know. We'll have to really see. This episode kind of feels like a pivot point to where next episode, if it happens again, it's the same formula and the episode itself doesn't work for me, I'm going to be like, I'll watch the show, but man, I'm waiting for the big Mephisto reveal, or whoever Rio Vidal is playing or whatnot, or whoever Aubrey Plaza, is really playing. But we'll get there when we get there, I guess. So, anyways, we kill a demon by singing, and then Teen is hurt, and so then they heal Teen, and there's a little bit of an ending, I guess, a bookend, if you will, where they're back on the Witch's Road. And I think what's interesting here is we get hints of things that I wish had been started to be fleshed out at this point in the show. Because I think the hints here, what's interesting is the romance between Rio and Agatha, that I'm hoping by next episode we hear a lot more of. Because by this point, you're teasing us, and now I want to actually see what's going on here. And then B, I think Agatha and her relationship with her son. Because what's so interesting, I think probably the single most interesting thing that happened in this episode was the last line, which is Rio Vidal looking at Agatha and saying, that boy isn't yours. So, because Agatha, when Teen was unconscious, looked very upset, about the whole situation. And I guess the implication here is that because she also reveals that if a witch puts a sigil on a person, they don't actually know, right? It wipes their memory or something like that, which is interesting. I think that's interesting. So I think Agatha might be clinging to this hope that Teen is her son and that she put a sigil on him, right? But by Rio saying that boy isn't yours, I think that that's also an interesting twist. Maybe she's lying. She could very well be lying, or maybe she's actually telling the truth. It's interesting. So yeah, at the end of the day, guys, we have this formula here, and honestly, this episode feels like a jumbled cluster of a lot of different ideas that they then plugged into this formula. And like I said, I'm not disparaging the show at all. I think that the show still has a lot of promise, and the next episode I could love. I just as easily could love the rest of the show and then call it one of the, the top Disney Plus shows that they've done. But so far, we're 3 episodes in. I really enjoyed episode 1. Episode 2 was pretty good for me. Episode 3, I'm enjoying them less and less, I think, as we go along. But episode 3 I still enjoyed because I thought the concept was executed pretty well and it was entertaining. But episode 4, I think, is where it kind of fell off for me a little bit. But I ask you guys, what did you think of Agatha All Along, episode 4? Did you enjoy this episode, or did you think it was probably the least best of the 4? Let me know in the comments down below, or anywhere in between. Just let me know what you thought in the comments down below. I would love to continue the discussion there as we continue to talk about Agatha All Along. Let me know in the comments. All right, guys, it's time to wrap up Rings of Power Season 2. For some of you, that might be a good thing, because I've heard from many of you in the comments that you hate the show. For others, like myself, who have been very much enjoying the show, it's a little bit sad because, like I've been saying for the past few weeks, just talking about these different episodes, and this channel is old enough to remember having covered the first few episodes of Season 1. You can go check out a review I did of episodes 1 through 3 of Rings of Power. I was so severely disappointed with Season 1. I thought it was so boring and so bland, and the little glimpses that we got of something interesting and something good were just so quickly wiped away. And by the time we got to the end, which was probably the most interesting thing, the whole Halbrand is Sauron thing, the season was over. And so I was convinced to watch Season 2. I barely even knew it was coming out. Everyone said the trailers looked great. I thought the trailers looked fine. But here we are. The critic reactions were really good for season 2, and I decided to give it a shot. So this is going to be a full spoiler discussion of not just episode 8, the finale of season 2, but of the whole season. So if you haven't seen episode 8 and you are worried about spoilers, just save this video, save this segment, save this podcast to watch a little bit later, and then come back and join us for the discussion as we go along. So that is the spoiler warning. Now, before I get into my thoughts on the finale of Rings of Power, I wanted to take maybe just a minute or two to talk about some of the discourse going around about the show. I don't want to give it too much time because I just want to talk about the episode and really just the things that I enjoyed and things I didn't enjoy about this final episode. But I have to say, there's a delicate balance here because on the one hand, right, I want as much discussion as possible that comes out of these episodes because I think the best part about talking about these things is not just me sitting alone talking to a microphone about what I think about Rings of Power, but it's interacting with you guys. It's really hearing your thoughts, and I've had amazing discussions. You can check out some comments, some exchanges that I've had with people who completely disagree with me. Some people say this is just a terrible show in my opinion. I don't understand why people like it. But then there's always the caveat of, but I respect that you like it, and I'm trying to, I wish that I liked it, and I really respect the fact and I enjoy the fact that you like it. And that's how we have these kinds of conversations, right? And to be frank, I've seen far too many comments over the past little bit that have been disparaging, insulting, hateful, and frankly are not really adding anything to the discussion. And so I have always made a pledge to respond to about as many comments as I possibly can. But I've also made a pledge, and I want to really formally say it here, to make this community inviting for people to have disagreements civilly and not just say what they want to say and go after people, whether it be people who made the show, myself, although again, that's maybe less of the point, but more so the other people in this community. I really want this to be a safe space where we can disagree with one another. And I know it's hard. It's the internet. I mean, I fully acknowledge that. But just to be aware that this channel is not a place where we tolerate, disingenuous hate just for the sake of, even if you think this is the worst show made to man, that's totally fine. You're totally entitled to that opinion. I'd love to hear why. But I'd also ask for respectful discourse and to understand that people will think differently than you. And that doesn't invalidate the way that you feel, just as the fact that the way, if I or someone else enjoy the show, it doesn't invalidate the way that I feel about the show. We're here to talk about it. We're here to enjoy the discourse, and we're here to have a good time. So that's what I wanted to say up front. Not going to go into it too much. It's the first kind of time, even in shows like The Acolyte or Ahsoka or, I don't know, Secret Invasion, I haven't quite seen this level of discourse that has risen to this kind of animosity before. And so I just wanted to address it a little bit further, and then hopefully we'll put it to rest as we go along. I'm never afraid to share my own opinion, as you can tell. I'm just here to share what I honestly think. I'm not going to cater it to anybody. I'm here just to talk about what I think. So anyways, big disclaimer out of the way. Let's actually talk about Rings of Power Season 2, Episode 8. So I have been really enjoying this season. Quick recap here. I loved Episode 1. Thought it was a really good starting point into Season 2. I was so surprised at how much I enjoyed it. Episodes 2 and 3 I thought were pretty good, if not maybe just okay, kind of in that mid to good range. And then I thought episode 4 was a huge step back. I thought episode 4 was something you would see in season 1. But then 5, 6, and 7 happened. 5 was the best one yet. 5 was the best episode out of the whole, season 1 and season 2 to that point. 6 was really good. It wasn't quite episode 5 or episode 1, but it was quite good. And episode 7, again, topped episode 5. Episode 7 is my single favorite episode out of all 16 that have come out. I really I loved it. It was great. And so we get to the finale. There's a lot going on, but as the momentum has been building, I had all the confidence in the world that they were at least going to deliver, if not the best episode in the series. They didn't have to do that, but just a really solid season finale. So let's go through the episode and go through some of my notes here, and then we'll talk about my thoughts on both episode 8 and then in general the series as a whole and what I'm looking forward to and maybe what I'm nervous about for season 3, because season 3 has been greenlit to the delight of myself and to the chagrin of many, I'm sure. But we can have that discussion in the comments down below. So let's start out here. It starts out with, actually not with the Amazon logo or with the Lord of the Rings, Rings of Power logo, but with Durin. And we see the culmination of the Durin storyline here. And we get younger Durin, Prince Durin, as he confronts his father in the mines. And again, it is really remarkable to see how they've turned this storyline around. I can't believe at the end of this season how invested I was in this storyline, because as he's confronting his father, I it's not like it's bringing me to tears or anything, but I really cared about what was going on here. And it is, his father is just so far gone at that point. It's kind of terrifying. And it takes a literal Balrog to come out of the ground and take down his father. Look, did it need to be the Balrog? No. It didn't. Like, I don't think the show would have been any more or any less if a random creature came out of the ground and if it was Smaug, if it was a Balrog. I don't think it makes any difference whatsoever. I think more it just represents what's going on here. And the fact that there's this thing, I think with these rings, the bill always comes due, to quote, I mean, it's a famous quote, but also just thinking about Mordo in the MCU, for example, the bill always comes due, and here comes the Balrog. And it's, I mean, obviously the visual effects I think are really good, and it's intense, right? And you kind of saw this coming. I think that for the most part, I saw this ending coming, where you kind of figured that King Durin would eventually give up the ring in a kind of self-sacrificial way. At least that's what I was thinking as the show was going on. And he does just that. And now Prince Durin is going to be King Durin. And that's just the prologue to the episode, because now, at this point, the Lord of the Rings, Rings of Power logo comes up, and then we get to the main part of the episode. So the fact that this is just the prologue is kind of amazing, actually, because it's a heavy hitter for sure. So let's get into the actual meat of the episode here. And here we go with Gandalf again. Gandalf is now in the village with the Harfoots and the other group of people that I can't quite remember who they are, because let's be real, like I've been saying, episodes 5, 6, and 7 mostly stayed away from the Harfoots and away from Gandalf. And honestly, I think that was for the best, because I think this is probably my second least favorite storyline. Or I should clarify, the Harfoots have been my second least favorite storyline. And Gandalf himself, his own solo journey, has not been my favorite either. Probably third least favorite thing that's been going on here. I guess maybe I should really say that the Harfoots and the Isildur Theo storyline have been some of my least favorite things in this season thus far. And it's no coincidence that episodes 5, 6, and 7 have really stayed away from them. But we're back, because it's episode 8, and I think while I maybe would have enjoyed if they didn't revisit these storylines at all, I understand also that it's a TV show and they wrote storylines and they wrote story arcs, and you have to wrap them up in some way. And so we're back with Gandalf. So he's back. He's in the village. He's with the Harfoots, and I was just hoping at this point that we would just get something interesting here, and we do. We get this dark wizard who comes onto the scene. He's been kind of teased, although I'm not gonna lie, he's probably been one of the more disappointing parts of the season, because we'll jump ahead to the ending. Nothing really happens with him at all. Literally nothing happens. He's a big, giant teaser for season 3, and I guess that's fine. He's played by, I always mispronounce this guy's name, Ciaran Hinds, who played Steppenwolf in Justice League. And so you don't just get, Hinds to come in and play Dark Wizard, unnamed Dark Wizard, for just a couple cameo scenes. I'm sure he'll be back in season 3. Obviously, he had one of the last scenes in the show where he's looking out ominously. So I'm sure I've been saying it's Saruman. I'm not sure how anymore, because he kind of reveals, he plays his hand that he is an evil wizard. And if you've read or watched Lord of the Rings Fellowship of the Ring, you know that it's in that story that Gandalf realizes Sauron's true intentions. I haven't read or I don't know the lore. Maybe there's some other backstory where Saruman is evil and Gandalf knows about it, but I doubt it. But also he keeps calling Gandalf old friend, and that seems very Saruman-ish. So again, jury's out. I mean, we'll have to see. I'm pretty sure it's Saruman, and they'll find some way to have Gandalf not remember all the evil things he did, but we'll see. We'll see about that. So anyways, there is that as well. So the Dark Wizard comes in, and he has this whole confrontation and lifts a bunch of rocks, and Gandalf does the right thing. And that's pretty much the conclusion of that storyline. It was a little bit interesting to me, though, to see how much more interesting the show got when there was this confrontation, because even though the Harfoots were there, it was really about Gandalf, and it was really about this Dark Wizard. And I thought that made, at least the Harfoots, because they were in those scenes, it made it a little bit more interesting to watch as well. So I also wish, though, that they would have stopped playing games with us a lot earlier and just told us it was Gandalf, because everyone knew it was Gandalf. And I mean, I only disliked one thing about episode 7. There are a few things in this episode that I have a couple gripes with, and we'll talk about how Gandalf gets his name, because, we'll talk about that later. I have some thoughts, but all I have to say is that I wish that they had stopped playing games with us a little bit earlier, and I wish they would just outright tell us who these people are, because one thing that I don't like about this show is that they try to be so coy with certain identities and who people are and who their names are, when in reality, Halbrand, Sauron, became infinitely more interesting when they revealed it was Sauron. And I don't know if they knew that or not, or if they were just, they think they're being really coy, but it's just something that I personally have been noticing, and it's something I'm not a big fan of. So we'll see what happens in season 3. We know most of the characters now. They're all being set up. It's just this dark wizard character, and yeah, we'll have to see what his deal is. But it is the first time, I'll admit, in a long while where I didn't actually actively hate the storyline as I was watching it. So that is, that's some improvement there. And then we get back to Numenor, and apparently there is a letter that says Sauron is allied with the Queen, and everyone goes nuts about this. It's really random, honestly, because I've been pretty invested in the Numenor storyline this season. It's not been really at the forefront of anything. I'm sure it'll be much more at the forefront next season, as Elendil and Isildur are probably going to be, taking up more. Sorry about the background noise, by the way. There's some stuff going on outside, but they're going to be taking up more of a prominent role here as we go along, because obviously Isildur needs to, start taking up a more prominent role because of his place in the lore, and also because the Nine Rings, right? Like in this season, the elves and the dwarves were really taking the front seat because of the elven rings and the dwarvish rings, and also Celebrimbor. But I think in next season, we're going to get a lot more about the quote-unquote men, humans, and their rings. And so we'll see where that goes from there. I just, I'd like to have seen a little bit more about what was going on here with this Sauron letter that automatically just turned everyone against the Queen and all those people. It's I don't know, it just felt kind of random. I also I heard rumors that they're they did cut out a lot of stuff from the Numenor storyline, and I can kind of see it now, honestly, because it feels really rushed. It feels like I'm watching a kind of half-baked storyline, and it wasn't as compelling as I would have hoped it was. So there is that as well. Then we get the scene here with Elendil and the Queen Regent, and she's talking about reclaiming your destiny and all that kind of stuff, and it just feels a little bit more disjointed. So there is that. We head back to Eregion now, and Eregion is on fire. There is a really cool one shot at the beginning of this sequence where we're just following the orcs around, and it looks really real. It honestly kind of looks like a war film, because I at least think, in these scenes, that the rubble looks really real, the debris looks very real. It looks like they filmed it on a real set, which is really refreshing. It just kind of has that gritty wartime, war movie kind of feel as they're fighting through a village, and I really like that as well. So then we have Galadriel, and she goes and meets Adar, and she's willing to give up the Nine Rings? ? It's a little bit odd and a little bit confusing to me. But then the scene where Sauron comes and just murders Adar. I mean, that's crazy. That's just crazy. We'll talk about that in just a second, because meanwhile, in the meantime, or I guess I should back up for just a second, because, Galadriel, she's not meeting Adar just yet, I should say. She's confronted by the orcs, and she says she'd give up the 9, which doesn't seem like something she would do, but I don't know. Maybe she would have in that scene. But anyways, Sauron is actually right now just torturing Celebrimbor, and it is, it's just hard to watch, but good for Celebrimbor to, defiance from him in his dying breaths. I think he was the standout of the season, along with Sauron, obviously. Those two characters together are, in my opinion, just always really great to watch. And so I really sad to see him go, but defiance until the end. And Sauron does let his anger get the better of him, because he wanted to keep Celebrimbor alive, because he wanted information about the 9. And in his anger, when Celebrimbor says, you're a prisoner to the rings, he lets his anger go. And that feels very Sauron-y. He made a mistake there, but he eventually gets the 9 rings anyways. And so I thought that was a really good scene as well. Going back, though, to storylines that I was not a big fan of, we have to now head back to Theo and Isildur. And again, waiting for Isildur to really step up here, because I think that characters like, I've been pleasantly surprised with characters like Elendil, for example, that I have warmed up to. He was such a non-character to me in season 1, really a non-character, but here in season 2, I've come to enjoy his storyline a lot more, and I'm hoping Isildur becomes that character in season 3. Even Arondir, towards the beginning of this season, I wasn't a big fan of what they were doing with him, but by the end of the season, him being a commander of the elven armies, really much better than whatever he was doing in season 1 and beginning of season 2. Just whole season 1, him just hanging out in the village, it was, I didn't love that. So yeah, there's that. The other really weird thing that happens in this scene is another random kiss between, is her name Estrid? I can't quite remember her name, but Estrid and Isildur. And again, back-to-back episodes with really random kisses. I didn't like both of them. They felt very rushed and very unwarranted, and I don't know. That was the one thing I really didn't like about last week's episode, and I think this one also felt just really random and kind of strange. So there is that. Anyways, Isildur is confronted now by that really annoying guy, the guy who killed that soldier from Numenor, and I don't even remember his name, but he's just so infuriating, and it's a little unclear to me how they managed to meet up at the exact same time. I think, again, a lot of stuff was probably cut from this Numenor subplot. It's a little unclear what the sequence of events is here, and it feels fine. I mean, it's setting up, again, some stuff for season 3 that I don't think is quite interesting, and I'm hoping they're going to get away from the village here, but it doesn't look like it. It seems like this occupation of this little colony is going to be something that they're going to talk about even further. So there is that. And then we get a scene with Adar. So now Galadriel finds Adar, and he offers her a truce once more, and he gives up the ring. Good for him. I mean, I think the Elven rings, based on what I've seen from the show and based on what I've read, are a little bit different. I don't think they're quite as corrupting as maybe the other rings are, because people seem to be taking them on and off, putting them on and off, and they seem to have some more good properties. Perhaps that's really because of Celebrimbor's more pure influence, and as it gets further and further, now the Dwarven rings and then the human rings, maybe they're more corrupting influences. I don't know. Maybe that's just me. He also says that he had another name, and maybe I'm missing something, but I don't remember, hearing what it was in this episode or any other episode. I don't know who else he could be, but that was quite an interesting tidbit to hear that he might have another name. So something that I will probably do some digging into and maybe find something out about that. But then Sauron shows up. All the orcs just absolutely murder him in a parallel to the opening of the season, and it was brutal. It was, again, Sauron just on a war path, on a vengeance path, and it is scary to see. And we get the mirroring, obviously, of when at the beginning of this season the orcs went after Sauron and killed him, or quote unquote killed him at the beginning. And then we get a fight between Galadriel and Sauron, and she is, I think, rightfully very overmatched. This is one of the servants of Morgoth, and yeah, I mean, she is completely overmatched here. And I think that some of the illusion stuff was really interesting that he was doing later on. I think I get it that he's really good at illusions though, but I think the fact that she fell for some of them a little bit more than she should have, I don't know. I'm of two minds on that, but I think that she got over that pretty quickly as he was turning into other people. I think it was really effective when he turned into Celebrimbor, actually, which I thought was cool. But I think some of them were fine. But I do like that they were using illusions, at least, that it wasn't just a hand-to-hand combat scene, because, I don't know, something about Sauron just fighting Galadriel hand-to-hand felt a little bit lame, but I think that mixing in the illusions was a nice little touch here. And then he stabs Galadriel. And this is what I was talking about in last episode, because when characters like Galadriel and Elrond get stabbed, it doesn't matter. We know they're going to survive. So it felt a little bit weird to me that they stabbed her. I guess ultimately it made more, maybe it was more about the stakes of having the dark energy in her or whatever. Maybe that'll play a part at, in the next season. Didn't seem like it was going to be playing that big of a role at the end of this season, because they seem to get most of it out of her. Maybe it's something like Frodo when he gets stabbed by the Nazgul in Fellowship of the Ring, and then it kind of affects him a little bit. I don't know. Maybe it's something like that. Also, Arondir is still alive. I completely thought he died in last episode, and he's still around. But I'm not mad about the fact that he's sticking around, because I think the role he's in now is pretty appropriate for his character. I think him being the commander of the Elvish armies is good, and the dwarves are here too. Although it's really sad because Durin is now in mourning. So there's that. Now, Galadriel escapes from Sauron by falling off the cliff, and I have no idea, honestly, no idea how she survived that. Really, really don't. But she falls, and I guess she survives. It is pretty creepy, those effects of how the darkness is coming after Sauron, the Shadow Realm, if you will. And I think that's cool, although they don't seem to really explore that in this episode, in this season. Like I said, I do think that because, they eventually heal her, I guess, by putting on the elven rings. I think it's interesting how the different rings are doing different things to different people. And I'd be curious if they explore that. Obviously, they probably will with the human rings, because I think the human rings are going to really be really corrupting. And we'll see what happens there with those rings. But yeah, I think that... and so now we have the wrap up. We just, in classic Lord of the Rings fashion, the ending of the season has 20 endings. So we kind of try to wrap up all the different things that are going on here. And I'll say this about the Harfoots as we get the narration here. Good on you. The actors, I respect them, obviously, and I know that they gave their best performances here that they could, but I would be very happy if these characters didn't come back for season 3, because I feel like even in the Gandalf stuff, they were just dragging the story along. And I think that hopefully now we're going to focus on characters like Galadriel and Elrond and the elves and the dwarves, Durin and Disa. And, I think the storylines that are starting to coalesce here a little bit. And I think that the Harfoots and I think the Theo storyline, I just think that we have so many storylines going on here that I think Theo and the Harfoots, to me, are things that we can maybe start to trim out of these seasons. And to be fair, this season really reduced their storylines. Again, nothing against these actors or anything. I just think that these storylines were starting to add weight to an already bulky season. The ending, I will say, because this episode was over an hour and 10 minutes, I think, and it feels abrupt somehow. And I'll talk about this more as we do our final wrap up, but I think that, like I was just saying, I think that there was a lot here, and I'll talk about how I felt about that as we do our final wrap up. But I do enjoy the fact that this feels very Empire Strikes Back, that everything is kind of hopeless, but there's always hope. That kind of classic final scene of Empire Strikes Back where they're staring out into space and things seem hopeless, but they're never really hopeless, right? As we wrap up here, we need to talk about Gandalf getting his name. I didn't like it. Because I know I did some reading, and I heard that the way that Tolkien named Gandalf, it had something to do with the root word for staff, I think, or something like that. Where I think it's Gand, something like that, where that has a meaning. They don't need to do any of that here in Lord of the Rings, because there's no Latin, right, in Lord of the Rings, so it's totally fine. I think it's Latin. I believe I read it was Latin that Tolkien used. Anyways, but they don't have human languages here, so it's fine. It doesn't matter. But they didn't have to do anything at all, is my point. It could have just been the Dark Wizard being like, old friend, your name is Gandalf. And Gandalf's like, that is my name. That's it. That's all you had to do. Grand Elf? Are you kidding me? Grand Elf? You know what it totally reminded me of? Solo, a Star Wars story. He could have just been Han Solo. It didn't have to be anything else. It was just Han Solo. Instead, what did it have to be? It's now, oh, you're alone. Solo. I think these things are really dumb, because I think that they thought the mystery of the name was such a big deal, and it wasn't. It's Gandalf. Everyone knew it was Gandalf. That at the end of the season, all they had to do was have the Dark Wizard go, old friend, you don't remember your name? Your name was Gandalf. And he goes, of course it was. And then we move on. That's it. It's not a big deal. It's not a big deal. It totally isn't a big deal, because, look, his name is Gandalf. His name is Han Solo. Get over it. It's fine. It doesn't matter. If the whole season was like that, I would have been so annoyed, but it's just one thing. It really doesn't matter. But still, Grand Elf? Come on. Anyways. It seems like also in these final moments that the Harfoots are going to be taking a backseat, if, even returning in season 3. And again, I think that we need to start moving. We need to start moving, because the season ends and the elves are ready to fight and we are ready to go to war. And I'm excited, because I think season 2, I don't even know what season 1 was, but season 2 was a lot about the deception, right? Sauron's rise to power. We hear this a lot with movies being like, it was this character's rise to power. And they are, but I think this season was really the rise to power, him building the rings in the shadows, manipulating Celebrimbor. I loved all those things. And I think season 3, we're primed for war. And I'm so excited because I think the elves are going to come, the dwarves, and then we're going to finally see what the 9 rings are going to do for the kingdom, for the lands of humans, for the lands of men. And I'm excited for that. So guys, that was the season finale. But let me just quickly talk about my thoughts on the series as a whole. I know a lot of you guys have been disappointed with this series. That's totally fine. For me, I was so impressed with how they were able to turn around this show from season 1 to season 2. I was so impressed because, again, I was in the same boat. I was so disappointed with season 1. I love Lord of the Rings. I've seen at least the original trilogy, and I've read all 4 main books, the Lord of the Rings trilogy and The Hobbit, and I love them. And I was just as disappointed, with season 1. I thought it was so boring and so bland. And here we are. And I think out of the 8 episodes, 1 was, I'm not going to say it was terrible, but it was really boring and it was really bland. So 1 was really boring. 2 were fine. 2 were really good. And 3 were top notch. Excellent. And the thing about those 2 is that the sequence matters, right? Because some of the early stumbles came in the first few episodes, right? But the show, once it hit episode 5, just continued to build and build and build and build. And I have my problems with this season finale for sure. I've just talked about them for about 20 to 30 minutes. But I think that, like I said earlier, I was alluding to it earlier, one of the problems I have with the season finale is just that there's too much going on, right? There were too many storylines that it felt like we had to wrap up every single one. Numenor, Isildur, Elendil, right? Just to kind of talk about the humans. The Queen Regent, Pharazôn, a lot of those things. And we had Gandalf, we had, the Dark Wizard, and then we have Arondir, Galadriel, Celebrimbor, Sauron, Elrond. There's just too many things going on here. Durin, right? That I think that we could definitely stand to have some, more concentration in season 3. And I think that also just having, being cognizant of what storylines are maybe more important than others. I think it'll be a lot clearer in season 3, like I said, because I think we're going to war. But I think that this season finale suffered a little bit because they were just trying to wrap up every single storyline, and they really weren't able to do that in everything, because the Dark Wizard just kind of showed up and then disappeared. And I'm sure he's going to be a big part of season 3, but in season 2 he was just kind of a whole lot of nothing. So I think that's the story of season 2, is that they learned from, in my opinion, lots of their mistakes from season 1, and there were still vestiges. There were still some residual effects of season 1, where I think you get an episode like episode 4, you get some storylines that are rushed, you get some things like the Dark Wizard where I don't think they had room or time or whatever to fit that in. But overall, guys, this season I thought was on balance, it was great. I am very excited for season 3, especially knowing that these showrunners were able to learn, in my opinion, from the mistakes of season 1. So I can only hope that season 3 would be even stronger, just even more focused, even more concentrated. And I hope that they carry on a lot of the good feedback that they're getting from those of us who enjoy the show. Because for those of you who don't, totally fine. It's completely your prerogative to jump off the bandwagon if that is what you feel like, and watch other things that you do enjoy. So that is where I'm going to end my coverage of Rings of Power Season 2. I know it's been a little bit of a rocky road, and I want to thank all of you who have shown your support for, just the podcast and the segments and whatnot. Again, I thank you all, for those of you who have been respectfully sharing your thoughts. I don't care if you agree with me. I don't care if you disagree with me. I'm very thankful either way that you were sharing your thoughts respectfully and, really contributing to the Access Blockbusters community. So, guys, let me know what you thought about the finale in the comments down below. Keep the conversation respectful for everyone involved, and we're all going to have a good time. Let me know in the comments down below. All right, and to wrap up what is turning out to be the absolute longest podcast of all time, we have Joker FOLIE A DEUX. And I apologize that the podcast is so long. You can go check out the entire podcast. As always, I post clips from each segment later on in the week as well. And like I mentioned at the beginning of this episode, I'm posting them a little bit out of order. So you might see some of these clips before the actual podcast is posted. But the reason that this podcast is a little bit long is just because a lot of these clips are reviews. And reviews, I just want to share my thoughts. So let's talk about Joker 2, Joker FOLIE A DEUX. This is going to be a non-spoiler and then a spoiler review. So I will be doing non-spoilers first, and then I will very clearly give a spoiler warning, and we will dive into all the spoilers and some of my thoughts on Joker FOLIE A DEUX. So, just to give a little bit of context, as I always like to do before I jump or dive into the review, let me tell you what I thought about the first Joker film. So I don't think in fact I didn't see Joker 1 in theaters. I saw it, I think, a little bit later, right as it was coming out on whatever, streaming or digital or whenever it was coming out. I saw it around then because it had gotten a lot of buzz and people were saying, oh, Joaquin Phoenix is going to win the Oscar, and oh, this might even be one of the, the first superhero film to be nominated for Best Picture, or maybe not. I think Black Panther was right before. But anyways, one of the first superhero films to be nominated for Best Picture, whatnot. And I thought, okay, I'm going to give it a go. And so I watched the first Joker. This was 2019, I believe. I watched the first Joker, and I thought it wasn't for me. What is the best way I would describe my experience with the first Joker. I didn't come out of the first Joker saying, this writing is terrible, the story is terrible, the characters are terrible, the acting is terrible, this is a bad movie. That's not at all the experience I had with the first Joker. But I also came out of it saying, I don't think I can say I liked it, because I just don't think this movie is for me. I understand a lot of what the social commentary was, right, about what society can do to people and the oppressed and the downtrodden, and how it can really lead to some very bad things for everyone involved, right? And, I think that that's a very important thing to take away from that film, is that I think we as people need to do a better job and, understand that, there are some really bad things that can happen in society when we, ignore people who are really suffering. And I think that that's a big part of the film. And I think the second film expands on that in a couple interesting ways about Arthur Fleck in particular, that I think I'll dive more into in the spoiler discussion, but I'll touch on a little bit in the spoiler review. But, I think the first film had a lot to say about society, and also obviously Arthur Fleck and people who are dealing with, mental illness or have conditions or whatnot. I think that the first film definitely had a lot to say about that as well. I think that, obviously Joaquin Phoenix was brilliant, even though I still maintain to this day, I watched almost every Oscar film that came out that year, Best Picture winner at least, and I think Adam Driver deserved it for Marriage Story. That is just my personal opinion. But that doesn't take anything away from Joaquin Phoenix. He did a brilliant job just combining that laugh alone, where he's able to laugh and almost cry at the same time. And this, in this film, even more so, we get to see that laugh again in a couple different contexts in Joker 2. And it's always haunting. It's great. Great in the sense of it's hard to watch, but it's great to see, an actor of that caliber really giving it his all. And I think that, for me, at the end of the day, there are a couple things about the ending that I didn't love. I'm a person who, I don't mind bad endings to films. Bad meaning, endings that are quote unquote heroes. I'm not saying for Joker. I don't know who the hero of Joker would be, but just films where if it's a traditional good guy, bad guy, the hero loses or whatever, or something tragic happens at the end. I mean, for goodness sake, if you watch my channel long enough, you'll know Infinity War is my favorite MCU film of all time, and I think that has the bleakest ending of any MCU film, which is kind of crazy to me. But I think that film had a definitiveness and a sense of, okay, like I understand why and how we got to this point. I think Joker, the first Joker, was, it was a little bit of just too much of this kind of open-endedness that made me feel a little bit dissatisfied with the ending, especially that thing of, was it real, was it not? I kind of hate that on balance. I think that there are a few times where it does seem interesting to me, but in most movies, when the ending is like, is it real, is it not, and then it's like, well, you decide, it's like, okay, figure it out. I think Inception may be one example, for example, but I just to say that I think the ending was a little bit off to me. So this isn't a review of the first Joker, obviously, but that's just to set the scene here as I was entering this second Joker film. So I had heard that, we did an entire podcast about how mixed the reviews were for the second Joker, excuse me. But at the time, right, because those reviews came out about 3 weeks ago, 3 or 4 weeks ago. And Rotten Tomatoes still held that film at about a 67% or something like that, which is fine. Maybe 62%, something like that. And that's fine. It's not great. And the first Joker, in its defense, was nominated for Best Picture. It won Joaquin Phoenix Best Actor, and it had a 68 or 69% on Rotten Tomatoes. So I was like, okay, on par. I think that what I should go into the second Joker expecting is about the same of the first Joker, because I think that it, from the reactions, people were calling it brilliant, people were calling it crazy and messy and a disaster, and I was like, okay, we'll see. And so I went into the second Joker kind of expecting to feel the same about the film as I did the first Joker. Now, before I dive into the review, one more thing. I actually came out of the movie, and I just checked Rotten Tomatoes just to see what was going on, and it is, to my shock, it is sitting at a 33% right now. People do not like this film. Like I'd 67 or 66% or whatever it was when it first started was maybe 30, 40, 50 reviews. It wasn't nothing, right? It was still a sizable amount. And usually when you have about 50, 60 reviews, it doesn't, it doesn't oscillate that much. Maybe from 65, it could go to 50 and it could go to 80. Like, I don't know. But to go to 33% after 250 some reviews have come in is actually wild. So let's talk about Joker Folie à Deux, non-spoilers first. So I will say that my experience with Joker Folie à Deux was in 3 parts. And I'm not going to give anything away. Because I think that if you intend on seeing the film, go in and know as little as possible, But I'll be talking about things that we know from the premise and the trailer and whatnot. Like Harley Quinn's in the movie. Sorry, that was in the trailer. It's, Joker Madness of 2, Folie à Deux. So my experience with the film was in 3 parts. I think the first 30 minutes, I was in wait and see mode. And I wasn't necessarily engaged per se. Like the film did not have me. Like a film like, for example, Knives Out. Knives Out had me in the first 10 minutes, and I was so on board, so hooked, and it built and built and built. The first 30 or so minutes of Joker Folie à Deux, I was like, okay, so they're throwing a lot at me, not just in terms of story, really, just a lot of things at me, a lot of concepts and ideas and a lot of things that I can talk about more in the spoiler discussion. And I was sitting there going, there are ways in which these things can pay off, and ways in which if it was I'm going to say this a little bit facetiously, but a skilled filmmaker, because I'm not saying that Todd Phillips isn't a skilled filmmaker. I'm just saying, just to give some clarity, a skilled filmmaker could weave these things together to make something that is really interesting and cohesive towards the end. So in the first 30 minutes of any movie, honestly, even if I think it's terrible, I'm not going to write it off, because I'm like, well, there are ways in which you can wrap it up, especially in a film like Joker Folie à Deux, when there are so many interesting concepts on their own that I think could have, I think could have really coalesced into something interesting. But that was the first 30 minutes. I was sort of in this weird limbo state of, I don't think I like this very much. I think it's very similar to the first Joker, where I feel like I'm just watching something happen that I'm not completely engaged in, but it's happening and I'm watching it. So there was that. The next 30 minutes of the film, I thought was quite good. Actually, there was a pocket of the movie that I was on board for. I don't know what it was. I do know. There were a couple things that were going on in that second chunk, the second 30 minutes. It's like minute 31 to 60-ish. I'm not saying it's exact. That I thought was really intriguing. I thought, okay, it's helping to tie together some of the things from those first 30 minutes. Not everything, but some things from the first 30 minutes. And then, it's introducing a couple new twists and turns that I thought could pay off big time towards a very interesting ending. Now, this is a minor spoiler. It's really nothing about the story itself, just more about the structure of the film. So if you don't want to know, skip ahead about 30 seconds. I had heard that there was something weird that happened at the end of the film. So I was preparing myself for something weird to happen at the end. What I will say is this. I don't think it was... I think I kind of get what people were talking about when they said that. I think that really in general, as, I said the first 30 minutes was one experience. The second 30 minutes was another experience. The last hour was a completely different experience entirely. There was one sequence in the film that when it started, it made me very uncomfortable. And then another thing happened that made me also equally as uncomfortable. And obviously it was intentionally so, I think, by Todd Phillips. And, that kind of goes back to that. It's just not the kind of thing I enjoy watching. In fact, I'm actively sitting there in my seat, very uncomfortable. And I don't think in a good way, even though it was intentional. And from then on, it was just kind of spaghetti against the wall again, but just crazier and even stranger and even more disparate. And by the time the film ended, I was like, I feel like I just saw 700 different things happen in the last hour. And I don't quite know what to make of any of it. So I think that was my experience with Joker Folie à Deux. Just to talk about other aspects of the film before I kind of get back to the story, Joaquin Phoenix is fantastic again. Now, I don't think everything he was asked to do in this film, because I think the first Joker, for what it's worth, he was a pretty singular character. I think that he was pretty consistent, and while he was crazy and having delusions, like with Zazie Beetz' character, Sophie, something like that, he was still very much Arthur Fleck, and he was still very much Joker. In this movie, he's asked to do a lot more. I mean, number one is singing, which, I don't think he was meant to sing like a Broadway star. He's fine. He gives it his all, which Joaquin Phoenix will always do, and that's fine, right? But, he's asked to do, other than singing and dancing, he's asked to do a lot more. And I'm not saying a lot more in terms of, asked to elevate the material. I'm just saying literally quantity-wise, just more things in this movie. And I think for what it's worth, he does them, and he commits to them, and he's, I think for what the direction was, he probably did about as good as any actor could possibly do. And there are those tragic moments as well where, there are scenes where he's laughing and you can see such utter pain behind that laugh. And it's that those are the parts where I really commend Joaquin Phoenix for. I think those are just signs of a great actor. Harley Quinn, Lady Gaga, I think is fantastic. I think that, again, what she is asked to do, I'm talking about the performance, not the character. What Lady Gaga is asked to do, fantastic. I mean, you couldn't have asked for anyone better for this part. Again, we'll talk about what she was asked to do, but I think for what she was asked to play and portray, really, really good. Other characters are not as important or as interesting. I mean, it's honestly interesting because it's Joker Folie à Deux, and I kind of expected it to be kind of equal parts, maybe not equal parts, but 60% Joker maybe and 40% Harley. It's maybe more like 75% Joker and 25% Harley, interestingly enough. Maybe even 80-20. Not in terms of screen time necessarily, but more importance of the characters, which I thought was actually something interesting and unexpected. You can take that for what you will, and I'm not necessarily saying that's a good or a bad thing, but I think going back to what Lady Gaga was asked to do, I just don't think there was that much. There were moments where I thought this character has a lot of depth and dimensionality, and those moments were very fleeting because I think that when you look back at this character after the film is over, you kind of go, I don't quite understand ultimately what we were going for here. I kind of get how she relates to maybe Arthur, but as a character in herself, I don't understand. It feels like we only scratched the surface of a very interesting character that we didn't get to spend a lot of time with. Now, in terms of other things, I mean, cinematography, it's great. I mean, the musical sequences are shot really well. And they're interesting to look at, and just like the first, everything from the first Joker film that are, the stuff that's not in the musical sequences, it's pretty much the same in terms of quality. It's great. It has that very distinct look of Gotham City for sure, and the score itself is also really good. I believe the same person who scored the first film, I don't remember their name, but is back to score the second film, and it's really good. It's good. In terms of the music, which I know is a part that we actually covered all the way back when, maybe 2 or 3 years ago, we talked about how Lady Gaga was cast in Joker Folie à Deux, and that it was going to be a musical. It's hard for me to call this a musical. I get it now why Todd Phillips said, well, no, it's not a musical. But it's not a musical either. And I think, you can kind of understand what Todd Phillips is trying to do with the musical numbers here. In fact, I think it's pretty obvious what he's trying to do with the musical numbers. I think the problem is that it just feels a little too over the head, over the top, hitting you over the head with it, and it doesn't really. I think there are some of musical numbers that really help you understand what's going on and give you much better insight into what's happening. And actually add a layer of emotionality, which I think that they should be doing. And there are others that just feel like, okay, we need to move on. Like, we get it. I get what the point of this is. We need to move on. And I ultimately think that the musical numbers, because everyone was like, oh, Joker 2 is going to be a musical. That's what's going to make it so interesting. The musical numbers, honestly, were one of 1,000 things that they tried to do in this film. And, just, again, spaghetti against the wall. Some things stuck. some things stuck half the time. This is one of those things that just kind of stuck half the time. And even then, it kind of just clung on barely, because I think most of the musical numbers, I was like, okay, at a certain point, let's keep moving. Now, I'll wrap up by saying, talking about the story just a little bit. I think that there are interesting themes in this movie. I think that there are interesting scenes in this movie. Like I said, there are scenes that also make me very uncomfortable. I'm sure that's intentional, and maybe some of you guys can watch those scenes and feel less, more engaged in what the movie's trying to say. I felt very much like I'm sitting in a theater, I'm watching these things happen, and I don't enjoy this. That being said, I think that ultimately what this comes down to is, I think that there was a point in this movie, like I said, a 30-minute chunk in this movie where I said, this is better than the first Joker, in my opinion, as somebody who didn't love the first Joker, but I thought there is a better movie in here. There is a very good movie, in my opinion, in this movie. It's just buried, unfortunately. It happens for about 20 minutes, and then it's just buried. It has nothing to do with Joaquin Phoenix and Lady Gaga's performances, and I think it just has everything to do with they tried too hard. They tried too hard to top the first film. They tried too hard. I don't think it's a lack of effort. I really think it's the opposite. I think they tried too hard, and ultimately what we ended up with was just kind of a bunch of everything, honestly. And I don't think the film really benefited from it. I really don't. So ultimately, if you liked the first Joker, I don't know if you're going to like this movie. I can't say for sure, because at the beginning, I kind of thought, oh, no, if you like the first Joker, then you're definitely going to. By the end of this movie, I don't really know if I can say that, honestly. If you didn't like the first Joker, like me, I'm fairly confident you're not going to like this movie. I think that this movie was trying to do a lot and to say a lot. And there are things I can take away from this movie that are pretty interesting and pretty thought-provoking. But at the end of the day, this is not a movie I want to watch again. Again, neither was the first Joker. I don't particularly want to watch that movie again. So you can take that for what you will, right? You can say, oh, I don't really, I respect your opinion, but I am not going to, put it a one-to-one comparison to my own opinion because I love the first Joker. That's great. That's totally fine. And I would encourage you at that point, then if you want to see it, go see it for yourself. Go see it for yourself. But for me, this was another example of, this is not a movie for me. I understand what they were going for, but even more so, this movie just felt like it was not for me. And I think that there were a lot of other things I could point to that were not necessarily things that popped up for me for the first Joker. So let's now move into the spoiler discussion. This is going to be full spoilers for just a few minutes here as we wrap up one of the longest episodes of Access Blockbusters Pod, one of the longest videos on this channel, I think. And we will talk about spoilers. So I was just stalling for a little bit. If you have not seen Joker FOLIE A DEUX, save this video, save this podcast, save this segment for later, and then come back and watch it once you have. All right, let's get into some spoilers. So let me just to break down what I was talking about here with my experience of those three parts of watching the film. The first 30 minutes, it opens up with a Warner Brothers cartoon, right? So I'm going, okay, interesting, right? I'm not saying it's bad. I'm not saying it's good. It's interesting. It could pay off, right? It turns out it didn't really do much of anything. It was just kind of a thing that they threw against the wall, and it was entertaining and it was interesting. But okay, we start out with a cartoon. The music, I think that especially towards the beginning, the songs were just like, he's crazy, he's in his head, he's imagining things. Okay, I get it. I get it. I totally get it. Especially the first song where he's just dancing around the prison. I was like, I don't think I can take a whole movie of this, honestly, because I'm like, okay, I get it. He's, the movie itself admits this. He's imagining these things. Okay, I got it. So, the first movie, and then he meets Harley Quinn just kind of by happenstance, although it turns out that Harley really wanted to meet him, and obviously he feels so alone, and so it makes sense in a way, but it also feels kind of rushed and kind of sudden that they meet, but okay, fine. And then the trial begins. So I think this portion of the movie, especially where Harley and he are really falling in love or whatever, I was like, let's see where this is going. I'm not super on board with the music. I think that the actual story of the trial and everything is interesting, but not captivating. And then him and Harley, Lady Gaga, again, fantastic. But I wasn't super on board with their love story or anything like that. But the 30 minutes that I was talking about, where I was really on board with this movie, there were a couple things here that happened. Number one, it's revealed that this is not Harley Quinn in this movie is not just another inmate. There's actually a couple extra layers to this character. She is a graduate student in psychiatrics or whatever it's called, but just like Harley Quinn. She's a psychiatrist. That's the word. I can't believe I couldn't think of psychiatrist. She's a psychiatrist. So, okay, great. And then there's more backstory and the fact that they start unveiling the fact that she starts lying about things. And I think that is actually such an interesting way to develop this Harley Quinn character, where she almost thinks of this Arthur Fleck in a very sad, twisted way of like a case study. And I mean, in fairness, in the comics, that is sort of what is happening, right? Like, Harley Quinzel falls in love with the Joker, but she was trying to study him, rehabilitate him maybe at the beginning, and then she ends up just falling in love with him and they go on their crazy love romance story, right? But I think that that's such an interesting thing to get into. And he's like, are you just using me? I think that sequence, obviously in the trailer we saw the drawing the smile and then everything. I think that sequence was just a great sequence. And I think that's an example of the musical numbers working to its advantage, because especially the moments where Joker is doubting himself, he's like, do you really care? And then she shoots him in the dream sequence or whatever, in the fantasy sequence. And I think those are the moments when those sequences are actually informing what's going on in the movie itself and the character's mind. So that's the one thing that I was really hopeful was starting to work, right? Really start to get into gear here. And I was like, okay, on board. I'm on board. The second thing was actually the courtroom scenes. I think the first chunk of courtroom scenes where they're calling witnesses, where Arthur is very nervous, and then he's hearing things about himself that are triggering things. And also just the defense itself. Like, okay, so we're gonna try to defend the fact, at least from the defense's side, that he is two personalities and Harvey Dent too. That's fine. Like, it had to be a prosecutor, Harvey Dent. Sure, whatever. Doesn't matter. I think whatever, he burns half his face at the end, but I don't think it was supposed to be serious. We'll talk about that other potential Batman Dark Knight connection at the very, very end in just a second. But I don't think it was meant to be that serious. So Harvey Dent, sure, is presenting a case that, no, this is who Arthur is. And I think that all that stuff, actually, if the whole movie was honestly sort of like Trial of the Chicago 7 style, courtroom drama, or even more recently Anatomy of a Fall, if you guys haven't seen, it was nominated for Best Picture last year. I think if it was a courtroom drama, I would have been actually completely on board. Now, I mentioned that the film started to make me a bit uncomfortable at a certain point. And that was when Arthur took the mic and was really just going after Gary Puddles and using all those voices and accents. And that entire sequence, I was just sort of shrinking in my seat going, this is so uncomfortable for me. Just the way he was treating Gary. And I think that is the intention, right? So I'm saying this in two ways. I'm saying this as, I think Todd Phillips is trying to say here, because Gary has that outburst right at the end of it where he's like, you ruined my life. And I think that is Todd Phillips biting back and saying, you have to understand. And here's the thing, right? Like I mentioned, there are really interesting things, really interesting themes that this movie is trying to explore, building off of that first Joker. There is a good movie in here somewhere. And I think this sequence makes me uncomfortable to watch, but I think rightly so, because what Todd Phillips, I think, is trying to say is that there is a balance here of, I think Arthur Fleck is not well. He is dealing with his mental illness and he is struggling. And I think that it is very fair to say that it was, especially based on the first Joker, it was society that let him down. And obviously his upbringing, we talk a little bit more about his mother and how she abused him, unfortunately. And I think that it's true to say on the one hand that society really let him down. But on the other hand now, what Todd Phillips is trying to say, on the flip side, is that he has still done very, 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 very bad things to people. And I think that to minimize that is also kind of a mistake, right? And I think that there's a lot of gray area there. There's a lot of nuance there. And to sit in it for a while is something that I think is quite interesting. So again, it makes me uncomfortable, these scenes, but I think that that's sort of the point. And then obviously, not to get too into it, because that's, this channel is more family friendly, I suppose, just talking in a way that anyone can watch these videos. But There's a sequence where he gets back to the prison, and there's a scene with the guards, and again, it's just uncomfortable to me, and so I'll just leave it at that. But I mean, even after that, at that point, one other thing, it just feels like things are happening, right? Because I think Harley Quinn ceases to become a real character at that point. I don't understand what she's doing at all after that point. I think that the courtroom kind of becomes a farce. I mean, they keep saying it, let's not make it become a circus, but it's a circus until he takes the mic and really says, okay, I'm me, I'm Arthur. Again, interesting themes there of the people who bombed the courthouse saying, only seeing him as Joker when he really wants to be seen as Arthur. But again, I mean, the courthouse blows up, and even that was a little bit like, whoa, okay, where are we going here? And then he gets stabbed at the end, and it's like there's just a lot of things that are going on here. And, I've seen some things at this point about, is the guy at the end Heath Ledger's Joker? No, obviously not. I mean, Harvey Dent is in this movie, I mean, you would think that Batman, Christian Bale's Batman, if this somehow was the Dark Knight universe, was, would have known that there was a previous Joker, right? Like, so no, of course not. It's not Heath Ledger's Joker. I think it is implying that maybe Heath Ledger's Joker could have come from a similar place, like this. Sure, maybe. But again, I think that no, that's definitely not Heath Ledger's Joker. But anyways, I think that, like I said, there was just a lot of stuff that happened towards the end of the movie that I don't know. It was a lot of dark stuff, obviously, and it was a lot of sad stuff, and obviously Arthur is dead. And I think by the time I walked out of the movie, there were some really interesting things. There was a lot of potential, but it was kind of a disaster, especially towards the end. Like I mentioned, there was a sequence in this film, about 20-30 minutes, where I went, no, this is going somewhere. It's good. And then by the end of it, I just thought, I don't quite know what I watched, and I don't think I want to know. I think that I'm good with what I saw, and that's about it. So that'll do it, guys, for my thoughts on Joker Folie à Deux. But I want to know, have you guys seen the second Joker film? And what did you guys think about it in the comments down below? Let me know. And let me know if you liked the first one more or the second one more. I'd be very curious to hear your thoughts on the first one in relation to the second one. And guys, that'll do it for, again, a ridiculously long episode of Access Blockbusters Pod. There are time codes in the description, as always, if you want to skip around. And also, these clips will be posted on YouTube anyway. So I hope that, whatever you were looking for, whatever you were trying to hear, or even if you've stuck it out all the way through 2+ hours, I appreciate you no matter what. Thank you guys so much. Make sure to subscribe, give this podcast a like if you're watching on YouTube, if you're listening on Spotify, whatever it might be. And guys, that'll do it from me. I will see you guys in the next one.